Welcome to today's video. Imagine a world where the darkness hides terrifying secrets, where the boundary between life and death blurs, and strange creatures lurk in the shadows, hungry, insatiable, and ever-present. Vampire stories, those blood-drinking beings, are certainly no strangers to us. But have you ever wondered, what exactly are vampires? Where did they come from? And why have their tales persisted and evolved throughout human history? In this video, we are going on a fascinating journey across cultures and historical periods to uncover the origins and evolution of vampire folklore. These creatures did not just emerge from modern-day movies, books, or horror tales. The roots of vampire stories can be traced back to ancient civilizations. From the bloodthirsty spirits in Mesopotamian culture, to the tales of Lilith in Hebrew mythology, to the blood-soaked legends of Eastern Europe, the idea of vampires has evolved over time. From terrifying beings to romanticized figures in pop culture, think about popular films like Dracula, or TV series like True Blood and Vampire Diaries, where vampires are no longer just bloodthirsty killers, but complex characters with emotions, love, sorrow, and internal conflict. But the question remains, do these modern depictions really reflect the true essence of vampires as described in ancient folklore? Or are they just part of a myth that has been reshaped over time? So, are you ready? Join me as we explore the deep roots of vampires and how these mythical beings have developed across different cultures and eras. Sit back, relax, and let these fascinating, eerie tales take you into a world full of mystery and darkness. Vampires, as we understand them in popular culture today, did not emerge from the shadows of history overnight. In fact, the idea of vampire-like creatures can be traced back to ancient civilizations, long before the modern image of a bloodthirsty monster with fangs and a cape. Cultures such as those in Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome each had their own versions of supernatural beings that fed on the life force or blood of the living. These early entities may not have been called vampires in the way we think of them today, but they laid the groundwork for what would later become the widespread vampire mythos. Take Mesopotamia, one of the earliest cradled civilizations, for example. In this ancient society, the supernatural was not just a belief, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. Mesopotamians believed in demonic entities that could drain the life energy of the living. These creatures were not necessarily vampires as we know them, but they were certainly terrifying beings that had similarities to the modern concept of bloodsuckers. Rather than being classified as vampires, these beings were seen as spirits or demons, often linked with dark gods and forces beyond human comprehension. What is fascinating about Mesopotamian beliefs is that they did not just believe in blood-drinking demons. These entities were often depicted as being linked with death, decay, and the afterlife. In their myths, these demonic beings were said to feed on the life force or blood of humans in order to maintain their existence, or sometimes to punish the living for sins or wrongdoings. This connection to life and death was a common theme in early vampire-like creatures and would persist in vampire folklore throughout history. In fact, many of these early entities were considered to be agents of death, harbingers of doom. In some cases, they were not the charming or seductive figures we might associate with modern vampires, but more often malevolent spirits with a thirst for the living's vitality. This early conception was a far cry from the myth of the vampire as a charismatic, dangerous figure like Dracula. The Mesopotamians, like other ancient civilizations, saw these supernatural beings as embodiments of darkness, of evil forces that lurked just outside the boundary of the known world. It is important to note that these early demons were not necessarily seen as bloodsuckers in the traditional sense, at least not in the way we visualize them today. The term vampire had not yet entered the human lexicon. Instead, these demons were viewed as life drainers, often feeding on the essence of the living rather than their blood. This was a broader interpretation of vampirism, a supernatural being that needed life energy to exist, but was not limited to the act of bloodletting as we think of it now. In other ancient cultures, similar ideas surfaced. In Greek mythology, for example, figures like Lamia and Striga were also believed to prey on the living. These creatures shared characteristics with the demons of Mesopotamia, as they too were linked with death, often targeting children or vulnerable individuals. Lamia, once a beautiful woman, transformed into a monstrous creature who seduced men, only to drain their life force, much like how the spirits in Mesopotamian culture would consume the vitality of the living. As time passed, the concept of these life-draining entities began to evolve. With the rise of Christianity and other religions, these ancient spirits were slowly reshaped and reinterpreted as creatures that literally sucked blood, giving rise to the vampire myth we know today. But looking back to these ancient roots, it is clear that the vampire myth has always been intertwined with humanity's deepest fears: fear of death, fear of the unknown, and the fear of supernatural forces that might hold power over our lives. In conclusion, the origins of vampires go far beyond the legends of Transylvania and Eastern Europe. The idea of blood drinking or life-draining beings has been part of human culture for millennia. From the demons of Mesopotamia to the mythological creatures of Greece. Though they may not have been called vampires in the way we think of them now, these early stories laid the foundation for the dark and mysterious figures that would later come to haunt our imaginations. The vampire myth is not only an evolution of these ancient fears, but also a reflection of humanity's struggle to understand and confront the forces of life and death that lie beyond our control. One of the most captivating and enigmatic figures in early vampire lore is Lilith, whose story has evolved dramatically over the centuries. In Jewish mythology, Lilith holds the distinction of being Adam's first wife, a figure who was created from the same soil as Adam, not from his rib, as Eve was later said to be. This unique origin story made her Adam's equal in many ways, giving her a strong sense of independence and autonomy. However, her equal status with Adam would ultimately become the very reason for her fall from grace. According to the myth, Lilith and Adam initially lived together in the Garden of Eden. But things quickly soured between them due to a fundamental disagreement. Lilith, unwilling to submit to Adam's authority, refused to take the submissive role that was expected of her. In the myth, Lilith's defiance of Adam's authority is portrayed as a monumental act of rebellion against patriarchal dominance. After her refusal to obey him, Lilith left Eden, an act that was considered a direct challenge to divine order. Her departure from Eden led to her transformation into a demoness. Exiled from the paradise of Eden, Lilith's role in mythology began to evolve into that of a sinister figure, one who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, newborns. According to Jewish folklore, Lilith became a dark spirit who would stalk babies and mothers, particularly in the night, draining the blood of infants and causing harm to women in childbirth. This bloodlust, particularly the consumption of children's blood, placed Lilith in the same category as other malevolent supernatural beings, adding an air of terror to her already rebellious persona. But Lilith's transformation did not stop there. Over time, she became not just a symbol of destruction, but also one of seduction and temptation. The legend of Lilith, as a demonic seductress, evolved significantly. She was no longer just a threat to children, but also a figure who lured men to their doom. Much like the modern depiction of vampires, those seductive, irresistible creatures who seduce their prey before draining their blood, Lilith's legend took on a darker, more dangerous edge. She was now seen as a temptress, drawing men into her grasp with her beauty and charm, only to ultimately lead them to destruction. This portrayal of Lilith as a seductive figure mirrors the modern vampire archetype in many ways. In many cultures, this aspect of Lilith's legend is viewed as symbolic of the dangers of unchecked female power. Her story is often interpreted as a warning about the potential consequences of defying patriarchal norms. Lilith was seen as a symbol of rebellion, a woman who rejected the prescribed roles of submissiveness and domesticity, ultimately transforming into a dangerous and uncontrollable force. In this sense, Lilith's character embodies the idea that women who defy traditional gender roles may face severe punishment not only from men, but from society as a whole. Interestingly, some traditions began to view Lilith not just as a demoness, but as a symbol of empowerment for women who resisted traditional norms. She came to represent a woman who refused to conform to the expectations placed on her, and in doing so, found a kind of dark freedom. In some interpretations, Lilith's defiance of Adam and her subsequent transformation into a powerful figure became an early example of female autonomy. This empowered version of Lilith contrasts sharply with the traditional view of her as a destructive force, and suggests that her legend, like many others, could be seen through different lenses, depending on the cultural context. The story of Lilith also became a metaphor for the dangerous allure of forbidden knowledge and the temptation to break free from societal constraints. Just as Lilith seduced men to their doom, she represents the dangers that come with rebellion and disobedience. In some versions of the myth, Lilith's association with seduction and the lure of the forbidden is a cautionary tale, one that warns of the potential dangers of indulging in desires that go against the norms of society. Lilith's complex character continues to fascinate people today, largely because of her dual nature. She embodies both the destructive power of disobedience and the seductive allure of independence. In many ways, she is a precursor to the modern vampire, a creature who defies the natural order, preys on the innocent, and seduces those around her. But Lilith is also much more than just a demoness. She is a figure who represents the struggle for agency, the cost of rebellion, and the power of seduction. As a result, Lilith has evolved into one of the most iconic and enduring figures in mythology. From a rebellious wife to a demoness who preys on children and seduces men, her story has gone through multiple layers of transformation. Today, Lilith represents a complicated blend of empowerment, seduction, and destruction. A multifaceted figure whose legacy is deeply intertwined with both the fear of female power and the celebration of its possibilities. Her myth has left an indelible mark on vampire folklore, as well as on the larger cultural conversation about gender, power, and the dangers of defying societal expectations. Greek and Roman mythology present us with some of the earliest and most chilling figures in vampire folklore, two of which stand out as particularly terrifying: Lamia and Striga. These ancient mythological creatures laid the groundwork for many of the traits we associate with modern vampires, such as seduction, shape-shifting, and a thirst for blood. Lamia's story begins as one of tragic beauty and transformation. In Greek mythology, Lamia was a stunning woman, known for her beauty and allure, but her life took a dark turn when she was cursed by the goddess Hera. The story goes that Lamia, who was once a lover of Zeus, became the target of Hera's wrath. To punish her for her infidelity, Hera cursed Lamia, turning her into a monstrous creature. Lamia was no longer able to experience the joy of motherhood, as she was transformed into a bloodthirsty demon who would prey upon the children of others. This curse also caused Lamia to lose her ability to sleep, and she became consumed by an insatiable thirst for blood. The figure of Lamia is fascinating because she embodies both the seductive and horrific aspects of vampire mythology. While in her human form, she would attract men with her beauty and charm, only to lull them into a false sense of security. Once her victims were asleep, Lamia would feast on their blood. Her allure and the fact that she could seduce her victims make her a symbol of temptation and danger, a combination of beauty, power, and insatiable hunger. As Lamia's transformation into a bloodthirsty monster progressed, she became less and less human, mirroring the qualities of modern vampires. Lamia's shift from a beautiful woman to a terrifying, blood-draining creature represents the loss of humanity and the surrender to darker, more primal instincts. Her lust for blood became intertwined with her newfound power, making her one of the earliest examples of the vampire archetype that would evolve in Western culture. What is particularly interesting about Lamia's story is how it mirrors many of the traits that we associate with modern vampires, especially the aspect of seduction. Like today's vampires, Lamia's ability to lure her victims through charm and physical beauty is central to her character. She does not just kill, she seduces, uses her beauty as a weapon, and ensnares men in a deadly trap. This theme of seduction, which is often linked to the vampire mythos, continues to be a defining trait of vampires in literature, film, and pop culture. Similarly, Striga, a creature in Roman mythology, contributes another fascinating aspect of the vampire legend. Unlike Lamia, who primarily targeted children, Striga was a more indiscriminate predator, attacking both children and adults. Striga is often described as a bird-like creature, part woman, part bird, whose primary goal was to drink blood. What makes Striga particularly terrifying is the belief that she had the ability to shapeshift, a trait that became a hallmark of vampires in later myths. In Roman mythology, Striga was said to be a creature that could take on the form of a bird, specifically an owl or other nocturnal bird, to stalk her prey under the cover of darkness. This shape-shifting ability is one of the most iconic and terrifying elements of the vampire myth. Striga's power to shift between human and animal form is not only an example of her supernatural Isid abilities, but also serves to emphasize the idea that vampires and their mythological predecessors are not bound by the normal rules of nature. The act of shape-shifting has been a defining feature of vampires in cultures across the world, and the Striga embodies this transformation in a way that connects directly to modern-day depictions of vampires who shift between human and monstrous forms. Striga's bloodlust also tied into the fear of death and the supernatural in ancient Roman society. She was believed to visit homes at night, slipping in through cracks or windows, and drain the blood of her sleeping victims. Striga's attacks were believed to be the cause of death for many people, especially children, and the legend was often linked with outbreaks of illness or sudden, unexplained deaths in communities. As a result, the fear of Striga, much like that of Lamia, led to widespread protective measures, including rituals and charms designed to ward off evil spirits or prevent a person from becoming a victim of such supernatural entities. In some accounts, Striga was believed to be a witch or sorceress, and it was thought that she could curse her victims, leading to death or madness. This connection between vampires and witchcraft can be seen in many vampire myths, and it highlights the fear of the unknown, the belief that some forces were beyond human control. Like Lamia, Striga represented more than just a supernatural being. She was a metaphor for the fear of death, disease, and the dangers of the night. Her bird-like form reinforced the association of vampires with nocturnal predators, creatures that roamed the darkness, preying on the vulnerable. The very idea that a person could transform into an entirely different form, escaping the human world and entering a monstrous realm, added to the terror surrounding these figures. These two mythological creatures, Lamia and Striga, serve as early examples of the vampire archetype, blending elements of seduction, shape-shifting, and bloodlust in ways that would become foundational in the development of the vampire legend. While Lamia's story is rooted in themes of tragic beauty and transformation, Striga embodies the more horrific, indiscriminate nature of vampire-like creatures, feeding on both the young and the old. Together, they offer a glimpse into the origins of the vampire myth and the deep-seated fears that gave rise to it. In modern vampire lore, we see echoes of these ancient creatures in the seductive allure of figures like Dracula or the romantic vampires of Twilight, but also in the more terrifying monsters that feed on all life, without regard for age or innocence. The influence of Lamia and Striga continues to be felt in the way vampires are portrayed as shape-shifting, seductive creatures of the night beings that are both beautiful and deadly, both captivating and terrifying. As these myths continue to evolve, we see that vampires, in whatever form they take, remain timeless symbols of our deepest fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of death, and the fear of losing our humanity. Lamia and Striga, with their transformative powers, remain essential figures in the rich tapestry of vampire folklore, bridging the ancient and modern worlds in a way that continues to haunt our imaginations. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, Eastern Europe became the epicenter of a vampire panic that would go down in history as one of the most bizarre and terrifying social phenomena. During this period, the fear of vampires spread like wildfire across the region, spurring widespread hysteria that led to grave digging, public executions, and even the staking of suspected vampires. This hysteria was not confined to peasants or rural folk by the end of the 18th century. Even government officials, religious leaders, and scholars had become embroiled in the vampire hunts. But what was it that caused this sudden and overwhelming fear of the undead to grip entire communities? And why was it so widespread that it reached even the highest echelons of society? At the heart of the vampire panic lay a deep misunderstanding of natural processes, specifically the decomposition of human bodies. During the 17th and 18th centuries, many people were still unfamiliar with the science behind death and decay, leading to a series of frightening misconceptions. When people died in the communities of Eastern Europe, especially from disease outbreaks like the plague or tuberculosis, the process of decomposition often presented strange, unsettling signs. The deceased sometimes appeared unnaturally bloated, with blood coming from their mouths, and their fingernails and hair seemed to have grown longer after death. To an uneducated populace already steeped in superstition, these signs were misinterpreted as undeniable proof that the deceased had returned from the grave, feeding on the living in the process. The presence of blood around the mouth of the dead was one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for those who believed in vampires. The common people, unaware of the natural process of post-mortem blood pooling or the effects of rigor mortis, saw this as a telltale sign that the corpse had been feeding on its victims during the night. Even the sight of a body's bloating was a cause for alarm. In reality, the gases produced by decomposition caused the body to swell, and the blood around the mouth was simply a result of the body's internal pressure. But to those who believed in vampires, these signs were anything but natural. They were damning proof that the dead were coming back to life and feeding on the living. In response to this terrifying phenomenon, Eastern European villagers took drastic measures to protect themselves from the undead. When a suspected vampire was discovered, the body would often be exhumed from its grave to verify the signs of vampirism. Once the body was dug up, the supposed vampire would be subjected to gruesome rituals, including the infamous practice of staking the corpse through the heart. In some cases, the body would be burned, decapitated, or even nailed to its coffin to prevent it from rising from the grave. These public executions were not limited to just the poor or uneducated. Entire villages were caught up in the fear, and some local leaders, desperate to maintain control over their frightened populations, even encouraged these practices to restore order. In one particularly infamous case, a government official in Hungary took charge of a large-scale vampire hunt, leading to the exhumation of several bodies that were said to be responsible for the deaths of local villagers. The practice became so widespread that it eventually attracted the attention of religious authorities and scholars across Europe who, though often skeptical, were drawn into the frenzy as well. One of the most well-known vampire hunts took place in the village of Kisalova in what is now Serbia, during the early 18th century. A series of unexplained deaths had plagued the community, and the locals, already prone to superstition, began to whisper of a vampire epidemic. In response, authorities exhumed the body of a man named Petar Blagojevich, who had died a few months earlier. When his body was exhumed, it appeared to have remained unusually intact, with blood dripping from his mouth. The villagers, already gripped by fear, interpreted this as a sign that Blagojevich was the cause of the deaths. They immediately staked his heart, burned his body, and reportedly even drank the ashes to prevent further vampire activity. While this may seem barbaric to modern sensibilities, it was a common response to the fear that had gripped the region. The vampire panic of this period can also be linked to broader cultural and social changes in Eastern Europe. At the time, many people lived in isolated communities, where disease outbreaks like the plague could ravage populations in a short period. These outbreaks were poorly understood, and the suffering they caused, coupled with the fear of death, created an environment ripe for superstition and hysteria. The belief in vampires was, in many ways, a natural outgrowth of the fears that accompanied such widespread suffering. People needed an explanation for the sudden and terrifying deaths that struck their communities. And the idea of a supernatural creature, one that could rise from the grave to feed on the living, offered a convenient scapegoat. What made this vampire hysteria particularly dangerous was that it was not just a local issue. It became a widespread panic that spread across various countries in Europe. Reports of vampire sightings and exhumations came from all over Eastern Europe, from Hungary and Serbia to Poland and Romania. Even after the vampire craze had subsided in some regions, the fear persisted. In fact, it was not until the mid-18th century that more rational explanations, such as the role of disease in the decomposition process, began to challenge these superstitions. Interestingly, the vampire panic faded as the Enlightenment took hold in Europe. Scientific advancements, a growing understanding of disease and decomposition, and a shift towards more rational thinking led to the decline of these beliefs. However, the vampire myth did not disappear. It simply evolved into a more fictionalized version, one that would later be popularized by works such as Dracula in the 19th century. But the vampire hysteria of the 17th and 18th centuries serves as a chilling reminder of how deeply superstition and fear can influence human behavior, and how a misunderstanding of the natural world can lead to widespread panic, violence, and tragedy. In the end, the vampire panic in Eastern Europe was not just about belief in the supernatural. It was a symptom of fear and the need for answers during times of crisis. It shows how, in the absence of scientific knowledge, folklore and superstition can take on a life of their own, creating hysteria that can change the course of history. The vampire, as a creature of the night, continues to haunt our imaginations, but its origins in mass panic, misinformation, and fear remind us of the dark power of folklore and the human need to understand the unexplainable. One of the most chilling and intriguing aspects of vampire folklore is the concept of living vampires, particularly in Slavic and Romanian traditions. Unlike the undead creatures of popular lore, these living vampires were believed to still walk among the living, blending into society while secretly engaging in horrifying vampiric activities. This twist on the classic vampire myth introduces a deeper layer of terror, one that suggests the very people around us could be harboring dark, supernatural powers. In some cultures, a living vampire was thought to possess the ability to detach their soul from their body during the night. This nocturnal spirit would then roam freely, engaging in sinister acts like sucking the blood of animals or even humans. Unlike the typical vampire of European tradition, which is typically associated with the dead rising from their graves, these living vampires were believed to be capable of both existing in the world of the living and venturing into the realm of the supernatural. The idea of soul detachment was particularly significant in Slavic and Romanian vampire myths. It was believed that these vampires had control over their souls, allowing them to leave their bodies behind at night and travel freely. In some variations of the myth, this detachment was a form of spiritual separation that allowed the vampire to feed on the life force of others. The soul would leave its earthly vessel, carrying the essence of the vampire's thirst for blood, and possess the power to feed and do harm in ways that the physical body could not. This concept of separating the soul from the body adds a terrifying dimension to the vampire myth, making them creatures that are not bound by physical limitations. In Romanian folklore, this notion of the living vampire takes on a particularly haunting form. Here, vampires were said to have the ability to transform into wolves, a common feature in many other supernatural traditions. This shape-shifting ability connects the vampire to the primal instincts of a wolf, linking the creature to the raw, untamed forces of nature. The vampire's ability to transform into such a fearsome creature enhances its predatory nature, reinforcing its role as a supernatural predator that can hunt freely in the dark, evading detection by day and attacking its prey by night. This transformation into a wolf is not just an eerie trick of the myth, but also a powerful reminder of the blurred line between the human and the beast in vampire lore. What makes these Romanian tales particularly disturbing is the notion that these vampires did not always remain in the shadows. In some stories, after death, the vampire was believed to return to its community, sometimes even re-entering society as if nothing had changed. These living vampires were thought to have the ability to return to their human life, resume normal activities, and even marry and have children, a terrifying thought for those who lived in fear of them. In these cases, the vampire was no longer just a creature of the night, but someone who could blend into everyday life, hiding their true nature behind a human facade. The most horrifying part of these tales was the belief that the children born to these vampires could inherit their vampiric traits. This created a perpetual cycle of terror, where the vampire's legacy was passed down to future generations, ensuring that the fear and danger of the vampire would continue. These children were believed to inherit supernatural abilities, such as the ability to drink blood, transform into wolves, or even engage in other vampiric behaviors. This idea of generational vampirism not only reinforced the fear of vampires, but also highlighted the terrifying possibility that an entire family or lineage could be cursed, doomed to pass on their dark legacy for generations. The concept of living vampires also spoke to deeper fears about the nature of the human soul and the boundary between life and death. These vampires were not simply creatures of the dead, as most traditional folklore depicted them, but living beings who crossed the line between the living and the supernatural. They were a disturbing reminder that death might not always be the final boundary, and that the spirit could transcend the physical world in ways that defy human understanding. In many ways, the living vampire is a reflection of humanity's greatest fears. The fear of betrayal, the fear of the unknown within our own communities, and the fear that the monster might not always be lurking in the shadows, but could be the person sitting next to you. This fear of a hidden vampire among the living, someone who might appear entirely human but secretly possess monstrous powers, adds a new level of horror to the traditional vampire myth. Moreover, the idea of vampires blending back into society after death also highlights the deep-seated fear of undead influence. If vampires could return to their families, re-establish their relationships, and even father children, what would stop them from spreading their curse further? The very idea that a vampire could live among us, undetected, is a terrifying concept that challenges our perceptions of the world around us and forces us to question the nature of reality itself. These tales also reveal a sense of social anxiety, where the very fabric of community and family could be corrupted by the presence of a vampire. A family line could be tainted by the vampire's curse, and the vampire's ability to return to normal life created a situation where trust became impossible. This fear of internal corruption, of something insidious lurking within, resonated with the fears of illness, infection, and decay that plagued society at the time. The vampire, in this context, represents a kind of moral rot that spreads within society, feeding off human weakness and leaving devastation in its wake. In the end, the idea of living vampires in Slavic and Romanian folklore adds a layer of psychological horror that is both unique and terrifying. These creatures were not simply a threat from beyond the grave. They were part of society, hidden in plain sight, waiting to strike when least expected. The legacy of these vampires, passed down through generations, ensures that the fear of the undead remains timeless, rooted in both the supernatural and the deeply human fear of what lies hidden within our communities. As we venture beyond Europe, we discover a fascinating array of vampire-like creatures that stretch across the globe, each one bearing uncanny similarities to the Western conception of the vampire. These creatures, while rooted in their own cultural contexts, share common traits such as blood drinking, predatory behavior, and a dark connection to death that make them remarkable precursors to the modern vampire myth. From the terrifying legends of India to the eerie creatures of Japan, the Philippines, and China, vampire-like figures are woven into the folklore of many societies. Let us explore these chilling beings, each of which offers a unique twist on the traditional vampire mythos. In Indian folklore, one of the most terrifying creatures is the Brahmar Rakasa. This monstrous being is depicted as a grotesque creature with an unsettling appearance that is both horrifying and symbolic. The Brahmar Rakasa is often described as having its head encircled by intestines, and it uses a skull as a vessel to drink the blood of its victims. The creature's nightmarish visage, combined with its bloodthirsty nature, makes it a creature of deep terror. The Brahmar Rakasa's appearance serves as a grotesque symbol of death, decay, and the violation of the natural order, an entity that literally feeds on the life force of others to sustain itself. While the Brahmar Rakasa does not fit neatly into the Western archetype of the vampire, its blood-drinking habits and horrifying physical form echo the core elements of vampirism seen in many cultures around the world. Moving to Japan, we encounter a variety of supernatural beings that, while not technically vampires in the traditional sense, exhibit vampiric qualities in their behavior. One such figure is the Kuchisake Onna, a ghostly woman with a terrifying smile that stretches from ear to ear. While not a vampire in the classic sense, Kuchisake Onna shares several traits with vampire lore, particularly in her predatory and parasitic nature. In folklore, she is said to approach unsuspecting victims, often children, and ask them, "Am I beautiful?" If the victim answers incorrectly or shows fear, she reveals her gruesome smile and kills them. Kuchisake Onna's predatory behavior, combined with her ghostly and dangerous nature, mirrors the vampire's thirst for life force, as she kills her victims by consuming their vitality. Another chilling creature from the Philippines is the manananggal, which shares many similarities with the traditional vampire myth, but adds its own eerie twist. The manananggal is a shape-shifting entity that can detach its upper body from its lower half and sprout large bat-like wings. Once separated, the upper part of the creature flies off into the night, seeking out blood, particularly that of pregnant women. The manananggal is not just a bloodsucker. It is also a predator that specifically targets the vulnerable, symbolizing the deep fears surrounding childbirth, pregnancy, and the fragility of life. The idea of a creature that can detach its body and fly through the night reflects the vampire myth's theme of transformation and the crossing of boundaries between life and death. The manananggal, like many vampires, represents the fear of an unseen predator, one that stalks its prey in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, in China, the myth of the jiangshi, or hopping vampire, presents an entirely different interpretation of the vampire legend. Unlike the Western vampire, which is typically portrayed as a seductive, elegant figure, the jiangshi is a reanimated corpse that thirsts for the life force of the living. What sets the jiangshi apart from traditional vampires is its distinctive hopping gait. Rather than walking or flying, the jiangshi is said to move by hopping, its stiff body stiffened by rigor mortis. This unique characteristic adds an eerie and almost comical element to the myth, as the jiangshi's stiff, jerky movements make it appear more like a grotesque puppet than a graceful predator. Yet, despite its odd movement, the jiangshi is a terrifying figure, often associated with the undead and the fear of death itself. In folklore, it is said that the jiangshi preys on humans by sucking their life energy, which makes it more akin to a vampire than a typical ghost. The jiangshi's thirst for life force, combined with its creepy hopping motion, adds an unsettling element to the mythos, blending the supernatural with the macabre. The jiangshi's cultural significance extends beyond just its terrifying appearance. It also reflects broader Chinese beliefs about death and the afterlife. The idea of reanimated corpses, driven by an insatiable hunger for life, speaks to the fear of improper burial and the disruption of the natural process of death. According to Chinese superstition, a jiangshi can be created when a corpse is improperly buried, or when a spirit is not given proper rites after death. This myth taps into fears about the potential consequences of disrespecting the dead or failing to honor the spirits of the ancestors, suggesting that the dead could return to punish the living. Across these diverse cultures, from the Brahmar Rakasa in India to the Kuchisake Onna in Japan, the Manananggal in the Philippines, and the Jiangshi in China, we see a striking pattern emerge. Though the specific forms of these vampire-like creatures vary widely, they all share common threads: a thirst for blood or life force, the ability to move between the realms of life and death, and a predatory nature that targets the vulnerable. These myths reflect the universal human fear of death, decay, and the loss of life energy, as well as the fear of being preyed upon by unseen, supernatural forces. In many ways, these creatures are a mirror to the Western vampire, and their stories reflect the shared anxieties and fears that shape the vampire myth across cultures. Each of these creatures, with their terrifying appearances and parasitic behaviors, serves as a reminder of the primal fear that runs through all human cultures: the fear of death, the fear of what lies beyond the grave, and the fear of unseen predators that lurk in the shadows waiting to strike. The global presence of vampire-like creatures suggests that the vampire myth is not just a European invention, but rather a deeply ingrained aspect of the human psyche, one that transcends cultural boundaries. Whether it is the shape-shifting, blood-sucking Brahmar Rakasa in India, or the hopping, life-draining jiangshi in China, these creatures show that the myth of the vampire is as ancient as it is universal. As we continue to explore the dark corners of global folklore, we are reminded of the enduring power of these myths and the primal fears that they seek to address. As we step into the modern era, vampire stories have transformed from simple, terrifying tales into a powerful cultural phenomenon. What began as folklore rooted in fear, death, and misunderstanding has now evolved into a rich and ever-expanding part of pop culture. The vampire mythos has been reimagined countless times in movies, TV shows, books, and art, from Dracula to True Blood to Twilight. These modern portrayals have taken the dark and haunting legends of the past and reshaped them into stories that both terrify and intrigue. But beneath the bloodthirsty images of fanged monsters and seductive immortals, the vampire myth still holds deep, ancient significance, echoing the fears and taboos of human culture. Vampires, as we know them today, are not just blood-draining creatures. They are complex symbols, manifestations of our deepest anxieties. They are embodiments of the things we fear most: death, the unknown, and the societal boundaries we so carefully maintain. In many ways, the vampire story taps into primal fears that have existed throughout human history, transforming them into modern cautionary tales. So, while we may view vampires today as fictional characters in Gothic novels or campy TV shows, the truths behind these creatures are as old as the myths themselves. By examining the evolution of the vampire myth, we can uncover the ways in which cultures across the world have grappled with the same existential questions that haunt us today. The first thing to understand about the modern vampire is that, at its core, it remains a creature defined by its relationship to death. This is not a new concept. Vampires have always represented something that transcends the natural order of life. In traditional folklore, they were often seen as undead beings, neither fully alive nor fully dead, hovering in the liminal space between these two states. Their existence was a violation of nature, a terrifying reminder that death could be cheated, that the finality of life could be disrupted. And even as modern interpretations of the vampire have softened this idea of an immortal existence, the inability to truly die remains central to the vampire myth. The vampire's immortality makes them both tragic and monstrous, forever trapped in a world where they cannot truly belong, and forever cursed to drain the life from others to sustain their own existence. This obsession with immortality brings us to another central theme in the modern vampire story: the fear of the unknown. Vampires are often depicted as beings that exist outside of human experience. They are different, enigmatic, and powerful in ways that humans cannot fathom. In this way, the vampire embodies the fear of what lies beyond the grave. When we encounter a vampire in stories, we are confronted with the most profound, existential question of all: what happens after we die? The vampire is a living, breathing reminder that death is not the end, and in many modern stories, they represent the terror of the unknown realm beyond life. As we follow the vampire's journey, whether it is a tale of seduction, violence, or personal anguish, we are also forced to confront the limits of our own understanding of life, death, and what comes next. Modern vampire stories often explore this theme through the vampire's alienation from society. Vampires are rarely integrated into the normal world. Instead, they live in the shadows, operating outside the laws of human society. They are marked by their difference, both in their physical appearance, pale skin, fangs, and red eyes, and their behavior. The vampire's need for blood is often depicted as a metaphor for societal taboos and the violations of social norms. In a sense, the vampire represents everything that is repressed in human society: desire, death, immortality, and the breaking of rules. The vampire's thirst for blood becomes a metaphor for the human urge to transgress societal boundaries, to indulge in forbidden desires, and to live outside the accepted norms. This idea is particularly evident in some of the most well-known vampire stories. Take Dracula, for example. Count Dracula is not just a blood-draining monster. He is a symbol of a society's fear of the foreign, of the other. In the 19th century, when Dracula was written, the fear of foreign invaders, particularly from Eastern Europe, was rampant in Western Europe. Dracula, as a vampire, embodies this fear of invasion, of something strange and dangerous infiltrating the established norms of society. Similarly, modern vampire stories like True Blood and Twilight explore themes of coexistence between the supernatural and the human world, forcing us to question how we treat those who are different, and whether our rigid societal boundaries are truly as necessary as we think. In addition to immortality and societal rebellion, the modern vampire also embodies a more personal, psychological dimension, the struggle with morality and self-control. Modern portrayals often depict vampires as conflicted characters, torn between their monstrous nature and their desire to retain some semblance of humanity. This internal struggle between good and evil is a powerful narrative that resonates with our own daily battles with temptation, guilt, and moral choices. The vampire, in this context, serves as a vehicle for exploring personal identity, self-worth, and the cost of immortality. They are often presented as tragic figures, struggling with the weight of their actions and the realization that their existence comes at the cost of others. In stories like Interview with the Vampire, we see how the vampire's endless life brings them more sorrow than joy as they grow detached from humanity and come to realize that immortality is a curse rather than a gift. What then can we learn from these stories? The vampire myth, at its heart, is a reflection of our fears and desires. They are not just creatures that haunt our nightmares. They are mirrors of our anxieties about life, death, and what it means to be human. Vampires challenge us to confront the unknown, the taboos that shape our world, and the consequences of immortality. Through their stories, we are forced to examine our own lives, our mortality, our desires, and the boundaries we place on ourselves and others. By looking at the evolution of the vampire myth, we see how cultures have struggled with the mysteries of life and death. The vampire has served as a symbol of society's darkest fears, offering both a warning and a fascination with the forbidden. Whether it is through the seductive allure of a creature who offers eternal life or the terrifying threat of a being that preys on the living, the vampire continues to captivate and disturb us. As our culture evolves, so too does the vampire, reflecting our changing attitudes toward life, death, and the boundaries of what we consider acceptable. In the end, the vampire story is not just about monsters. It is about us, and the way we navigate the fears that haunt us all. So what can we learn from this long, eerie history of vampires? Beyond the blood, the fangs, and the screams, vampires symbolize much more than just supernatural horror. They are, at their core, mirrors reflecting the deepest fears and mysteries that have haunted human societies for centuries. From their earliest appearances in ancient mythologies to their modern-day portrayals in books, movies, and television shows, vampires serve as symbols of humanity's most profound anxieties: our fear of death, our uncertainties about the afterlife, and our constant struggle to understand the forces that govern life and existence. Vampires in many ways are representations of the fragility of life. The concept of a creature that feeds on life itself, that thrives off of the vitality of others, echoes the fundamental truth that all living things are finite. Vampires do not just take blood, they take life, which underscores the transient nature of human existence. The vampire's insatiable thirst for blood can be seen as a reflection of the human fear that life is fleeting, that everything, no matter how vibrant or strong, will eventually fade. In this way, the vampire is not just a monster. It is a reminder of our own vulnerability, our mortality, and the inevitable passage of time. This fragility of life is often intertwined with a deep fear of the unknown, the uncharted territory that lies beyond the grave. The vampire myth, with its emphasis on immortality, raises the question, what happens when life is no longer finite? The vampire, as an immortal being, is caught in the realm of the undead, a place that is neither fully alive nor truly dead. This liminal existence challenges our understanding of what it means to live and die, forcing us to confront our own existential fears. The idea of immortality is both a blessing and a curse for the vampire, just as it would be for any human. While the vampire lives on, they are often portrayed as detached from the world around them, experiencing eternal life as a kind of distant, hollow existence. This immortality is often depicted as a burden, a fate worse than death. In many vampire stories, the immortal creature becomes increasingly isolated, haunted by centuries of memories, and the realization that they are no longer fully human. This reflects the human fear of death, but also the fear of eternal life without purpose or meaning, a paradoxical existence where time stretches on without end, devoid of new experiences, relationships, or growth. Moreover, the vampire is often a symbol of societal fears of the unknown, of the foreign, and of transgression. The very nature of vampires as creatures who feed on the life force of others places them in direct opposition to the natural order. They challenge the moral fabric of society by violating the most basic tenets of life, the need for balance, respect for others, and the sanctity of death. The act of drinking blood is often portrayed as a transgression, a breaking of boundaries and a crossing of lines that should not be crossed. In many cultures, blood is considered sacred, symbolizing life itself, and to consume it is to partake in something taboo. Vampires, as creatures that blur the lines between life and death, morality and immorality, belong to a category of beings that disrupt the natural order. In this way, they become symbols of rebellion against death, against society, and against the boundaries that keep us safe. The fear of the vampire, then, is also a fear of breaking societal norms, a fear of what happens when the rules are abandoned, when the safe boundaries we have created are violated. The fascination with vampires also speaks to the human need to confront our deepest fears. Throughout history, people have used myths, legends, and stories to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of the things that frighten them. Vampires, in their various forms across cultures, have served as a vehicle for exploring these fears. By creating these creatures, societies have been able to articulate the terrifying unknowns of life and death in a way that is tangible, a way that can be confronted in stories rather than in reality. Vampires serve as a cathartic tool, allowing us to examine our fears of death, immortality, and the darkness that lurks just beyond. Our understanding. What is fascinating is how the vampire myth has evolved over time, adapting to cultural changes and reflecting the shifting anxieties of each era. In the past, vampires were primarily feared as monstrous creatures that were capable of spreading disease, causing death, and preying on the vulnerable. They were symbols of the dangers of the unknown, of plague and pestilence, and of the fear that death might not be the end. In modern times, however, vampires have been reimagined as tragic anti-heroes, immortal beings who struggle with their existence, their morality, and their relationships with humans. Through these modern portrayals, vampires have become a reflection of human desires and dilemmas, serving as a canvas onto which we project our own fears and hopes. Today, we view vampires not just as terrifying monsters, but as complex characters who mirror our internal struggles with morality, identity, and the search for meaning in an often chaotic world. The vampire myth has also evolved in response to societal changes. As we face contemporary issues like the fear of disease, alienation, social exclusion, and the loss of human connection, vampires, particularly those in modern stories, reflect these concerns. The isolation of the vampire, unable to form lasting human connections due to their immortality, mirrors our own fears of loneliness and disconnection in an increasingly digital and fragmented world. The vampire's thirst for blood, which once symbolized a violation of the natural order, now represents a deeper hunger. A hunger for meaning, for love, and for the essential human experiences that make life worth living. So, the next time you encounter a vampire in a book or movie, remember that it is not just a monster. It is a reflection of the deepest fears and the complexities that have haunted humanity for centuries. Vampires are more than just supernatural creatures. They are reflections of our own anxieties about death, immortality, and the boundaries of human existence. They remind us of our fragile, finite nature and force us to confront the mysteries that lie beyond life and death. As we continue to tell stories of vampires, we are not just spinning tales of horror, but are also engaging in a cultural dialogue about the most fundamental questions that define our existence. Whether we view them as terrifying monsters or tragic heroes, vampires serve as enduring symbols of the things we fear, the things we desire, and the things we cannot fully understand. And the things we cannot fully understand. And the things we cannot fully understand. And the things we cannot fully understand.